struggling cowboy, lived alone for years until 10 wounded girls collapsed at his gate. But why? Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when the end this story, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. She had walked for weeks through snow and silence, her arms cradling the last child who could still draw breath. The others followed in a wavering line, thin shadows against the white, their faces streaked with soot and blood, their feet bare and bleeding. And on that bitter Dakota night, the wind drove them to the door of a man who had buried his heart with his wife and child. When he opened it, the porch groaned under the weight of 10 small bodies. Comanche girls, wounded and half frozen, their silence louder than any scream. It was the moment his tomb became a threshold, and hers, a place she might dare to stop running. The Dakota wind had a way of stripping a man down to the bone, not just his body, but whatever was left of his spirit. For Silas Blackwood, it had been doing that for 5 long years. Once, he'd been a husband and a father. Once, he'd been a soldier, a field medic who could stitch a man back together with nothing but a needle, boiled water, and a prayer. But diphtheria had taken his Sarah and their boy, Daniel, in the span of a week. After that, Silas put down the life he'd been carrying and walked away from the world. Now, his cabin was little more than a single-room tomb on the edge of the plains, where the wind was his only conversation and the hawk circling overhead his only neighbor. He lived by the hour, not the day. The fire in the hearth was for heat, not comfort. The stew in the pot was for fuel, not pleasure. Every morning, he checked his traps. Every evening, he mended what the weather had torn. That night, late autumn, 1876, the air smelled of coming snow. Silas was at the table, whittling a piece of pine without much thought, when he heard it. Not the wind, not a coyote, something softer, thinner, human. Rifle in hand, he opened the door a crack. The wind snatched at it, dragging in the smell of pine and the iron-sharp tang of blood. There they were, 10 of them, a tangle of torn buckskin, matted hair, bare feet blue with cold. The oldest, barely more than a girl herself, had her arms wrapped around the smallest one, her body curved in a shield. Her eyes were black pits of fear and defiance. She met his gaze like a cornered wolf. Silas didn't ask who they were, didn't ask where they'd come from. He simply stooped, lifting the 2 smallest, their bones weightless, in his arms, and carried them inside. Then he went back, again and again, until all 10 were laid before the fire. The cabin was suddenly full, the air thick with their shivering breath, their silence like a living thing. Silas knew that, just as the snow outside would soon bury every track in the world, this moment would bury the life he'd been living. He closed the door against the rising storm and looked at the oldest girl and wondered, would she dare to stay? Part 1. The storm came quick, the way they do on the high Dakota plains, a clean, white fury, swallowing every trail, every horizon. By morning, the world beyond the cabin walls would be nothing but a blank page. But inside, another kind of storm had taken root. Silas moved with the same grim precision that had carried him through battlefields and the hollow years that followed. He set another log on the fire, careless of the sparks that leapt toward his sleeve. Then he knelt beside the nearest child, a girl with ash-smudged cheeks and lips pale as winter sky. He touched the back of his hand to her face, cold, far too cold. One by one, he checked them. Knife cuts, burns where cloth had fused to skin, bruises blooming dark across fragile ribs. He set water to boil in the black iron pot, the hiss of steam the only sound in the room. Whiskey served as both cleanser and courage. With the steady hands of a man who'd stitched dying boys under cannon fire, he cleaned their wounds and sewed the deeper gashes closed. He worked in silence, breath measured, face set like stone. The girls didn't thank him. They didn't speak at all. Their eyes alone moved, following him the way deer track the shadow of a wolf. The eldest, her gaze black as polished obsidian, placed herself between him and the younger ones. When he reached for a child, her hand twitched toward a knife that wasn't there. Watchfulness was all she had left, and she wore it like armor. Silas understood. Trust was a currency they had no reason to spend. By the second day, the blizzard had sealed them in. Snow drifted high against the cabin walls, the wind's low moan threading through the chinks in the logs. The fire never slept. Silas fed it with every stick and split log he'd saved for the winter. When the pot emptied, he filled it again. Broth, stretched thin with rabbit meat from his traps. At night, he didn't take the bed. Instead, he sat in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, old soldier's habit. The man on watch doesn't lie down. The girls huddled together under blankets, breath rising in faint white wisps toward the rafters. In the half-light, their stillness echoed too much of the photograph on his mantel. Sarah's gentle smile, Daniel's small hand clutching her sleeve, and there it was again, that cold knot lodged deep in his chest, the wound that had never healed. He had failed them, failed to keep them breathing, laughing, living. No fight, no skill had been enough to keep them from the grave. That truth had driven him here, to a cabin built for one. But now there were 10 small, fragile lives in his keeping. And for the first time in years, he felt the old, dangerous, stirring the instinct to protect. He didn't welcome it. He feared it, because the last time he'd felt it, he'd lost everything. On the third morning, as pale light bled through the shutters, he found himself carving without thought, the knife whispering through pine. When he stopped, a small deer sat in his palm, head turned, as if listening. He set it on the mantel, said nothing. By dusk, it was gone. He found it later, clutched in the sleeping fist of the smallest girl. That night, Silas sat in his chair, staring into the fire. The wind screamed outside, inside. 10 breathing reasons to keep the rifle loaded and the door barred. He thought of the deer in that tiny hand, thought of Sarah's voice, soft as a lullaby, and wondered if, perhaps, the tomb he had built around himself had begun to crack. Part 2. The blizzard was no longer a storm. It was a wall. Day after day, the cabin floated in a white, soundless sea, cut off from everything but the slow, steady breathing of those inside. The air grew thick with the mingled scents of smoke, simmering broth, pine resin, and the faint sour tang of damp wool drying by the hearth. Silas kept himself moving splitting wood, tending the fire, checking traps when the wind eased. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And feeling was a luxury he had long since sworn off. The girls kept to their silence, but their eyes never rested. He could read the language of fear as easily as he could read fresh tracks in snow. The younger ones flinched at the sharp crack of the fire. The older ones glanced toward the door whenever the wind howled, as if it carried the voices of men they had known too well. And always, there was Nami, motionless, watchful, her gaze fixed like a mountain cat guarding the mouth of her den. He gave them space when he set out bowls of broth. He did it without a word. Nami would taste each one first, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly if the flavor shifted. as if even here, in this barren nowhere, danger could seep in through the food. When he changed their bandages, her dark eyes followed every movement of his hands. She was not yet weighing whether to trust him. She was deciding whether she could afford the risk. On the 5th day, the knife found its way into his palm again. This time, when he stopped carving, a hawk sat in his hand, wings folded tight, eyes forward, already choosing its prey. He left it on the table. By morning, it was gone. He didn't search for it, but later that night, he saw the second youngest girl, holding it close against her chest as she slept, the sharp beak and folded wings standing guard over her dreams. It was a small exchange, but in the quiet language they were learning together, a language without words. It was loud. And then, one afternoon, the exchange came the other way. He had been outside breaking ice from the water trough when he noticed something different about his shirt. At the elbow, where the wool had worn thin, a small square of fabric had been neatly sewn into place. The stitches were fine, deliberate. He turned toward the cabin. Through the rippled glass, he saw Nami at the fire, her head bent as she wove another girl's hair into a long braid. It was the first gift he had received in 5 years. He said nothing, but that night, his calloused fingers found the patch again and again, tracing the careful work as though it might vanish. But for every small thread of trust they stitched between them, something darker was weaving itself outside. That evening, running the trap line through the near woods, Silas paused on a low rise and let his gaze sweep the frozen horizon. Through the drifting snow, far off along the northern ridge, he saw them 3 riders, moving slow and deliberate, not wandering, not lost. They kept a line, their pace too measured to be chance. They weren't traders. They weren't neighbors. His jaw tightened. He turned for home, the wind cutting his face like shards of glass. He would say nothing. Not yet. Not until he knew for certain. That night, while the girls slept in their bundled warmth, firelight shifting gold across their faces, Silas sat in his chair by the door, rifle across his knees. His eyes stayed fixed on the black beyond the shutters. Whatever had driven those children through the snow to his cabin, it wasn't done with them. And now, because he had let them in, it wasn't done with him. Part 3. The riders came again. 3 black shapes on the frozen horizon, creeping closer with the patience of hunters, measuring the land between themselves and the cabin day after day, step by deliberate step. Silas didn't tell the girls, but Nami knew. Somehow, she always knew. Her eyes followed him now whenever he went to the door. When he returned from the trap line, snow crusting his coat, she would look past him toward the ridge. Each time, her jaw set a little harder, like a lock turned 1 notch tighter. It was during one of those wordless glances that the first crack in her wall showed. That night, a child screamed in her sleep, a sharp, sudden cry, the kind that drags a man straight from the depths of slumber. Silas was on his feet before thought caught up, rifle in hand, eyes sweeping for danger. Then he remembered where he was. By the fire's glow, Nami was already moving toward the small bundle of blankets. She gathered the girl in her arms and rocked her gently, whispering words in Comanche low, rhythmic, heavy with grief. Her voice caught once, and she bit it back. Silas turned away, granting her the privacy she didn't ask for but surely needed. Still, the picture in his mind was growing clearer. Whoever those riders were, they weren't strangers to the fear living in this room. 2 days later, the truth began to surface, not in full confession, but in fragments. It lived in the way the older girls startled at a man's voice outside, in Nami's white-knuckled hold on the smallest child, whenever the wind carried the echo of hoofbeats. And then it came, sudden as a crack in winter ice, when she finally broke their silent bargain. They were working near the hearth. Nami and two older girls bent over their mending. Silas patching a split log with resin. The storm outside had eased to a pale curtain of snow. The sort of quiet that makes a man listen harder. Without looking at him, she spoke. Men, bluecoats, no warriors left. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. The words slow, deliberate. She didn't look up, but her needle froze in the cloth. Silas didn't push her, didn't ask for more. He knew sometimes the telling is heavier than the memory itself. So he waited. In the days that followed, the pieces came in drips and shadows, not from her lips alone, but from the nightmares that gripped the girls. From a name Thorne spat like a curse between clenched teeth. Then, one morning, as he was cleaning his rifle, Nami stepped up to him. She didn't meet his eyes. Her gaze stayed on the weapon. "Show me," she said. It had been years since he'd taught anyone to shoot. Years since he'd stood in snow, correcting a stance. The angle of shoulders, the slow squeeze of a trigger. Her hands were steady, the steadiness of someone already tempered by loss. She took the rifle as if it were weightless, though the stock ran nearly the length of her arm. He showed her how to rest her cheek against the wood, how to breathe before the shot. The first report cracked through the frozen trees, scattering a black cloud of crows into the pale sky. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on her mark, her breath slow, her jaw set. And in that moment, Silas saw something he recognized, not the hunger to kill, but the will to protect, the same iron line that had once run through him on battlefields, long gone. Back inside, he leaned the rifle within her reach. She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no suspicion in her eyes. And he knew then, whatever was coming down out of that white horizon would find more than one defender standing in its way. That night, through the rattling shutters, men's voices rode the wind, too far to catch the words, but close enough for the tone to chill his blood. Somewhere beyond that northern ridge, Colonel Thorne was drawing his circle tighter. Silas stoked the fire high, the flames throwing restless shadows across the log walls. He looked at the 10 small forms huddled under their blankets, and for the first time in 5 long years, the thought of dying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like purpose. Part 4. The wind has a way of warning a man before trouble comes. That morning, it blew sharp from the north, heavy with the taste of iron and the flat promise of snow yet to fall. By afternoon, the ridge beyond the cabin had vanished beneath a curtain of white, but Silas knew they were out there. He could feel it in his bones. He worked with the same calm that had carried him through every impossible hour of his life. Shutters barred, leaving only narrow slits for a rifle's eye. Sacks of flour and potatoes stacked waist-high against the door. The root cellar cleared, lined with blankets. Every movement measured. Deliberate a man, laying stones in a wall. He might have to die behind. When the last of it was done, he looked to Nami. Her dark eyes didn't waver. "The cellar," he said quietly. "When I tell you, you take them. Stay put, no matter what you hear." For a moment, she studied him. Snow, soft light shifting across her face. Then she gave a single, short nod. The nod of someone who had already decided she would not run. By dusk, the blizzard was upon them. Snow, swept in sheets, so dense a man could disappear 6 feet away. It was the kind of storm that kills the careless and shields the careful. Nature, for now, was picking a side. Through the howl came the sound, the hollow drum of hooves. A voice followed, riding the wind, slick with command. "Silas Blackwood, Colonel Thorne, Dakota Territorial Militia. We know you have them. Send out the Comanche filth, and you live to see the spring." Silas stood at the slit in the shutter, rifle cool and steady in his hands. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel were silent now. All that remained was the living reason behind him. "This is my home," he called back, each word laid like a stone in a wall. "They're under my protection." Thorne's laugh was brittle. "Have it your way." "Traitor!" The first shot came a spark off the chimney stone, whining away into the storm. Silas didn't flinch. He sighted on a blur by the woodpile, squeezed the trigger. A man went down, his cry swallowed by the wind. The cabin came alive with gunfire, the sharp crack of rifles, the acrid bite of powder, the thunk of bullets burying themselves in pine. Silas moved from window to window, letting the storm's white fury hide his position. Thorne's men fired blind, their shapes flickering and vanishing in the swirl. He gave the signal. Nami herded the girls into the root cellar, pulled the trapdoor shut. In the dark, she held the smallest ones close, humming a low, tuneless song of her people. But her gaze stayed fixed on the thin crack of light between the boards. Through it, she caught a shadow. A man creeping along the cabin wall, pistol in hand. Silas couldn't see him. Her pulse hammered. She slipped from the cellar, seized the spare rifle from beside the table, and did exactly as he had taught her. Her shot shattered the frame, driving the man into the open. It was all the chance Silas needed. He swung around and fired. The threat crumpled into the snow. He saw her then, smoke curling from the barrel, her face pale but fierce. Pride surged in him, hot enough to burn through the cold. They were no longer one protector and 10 charges. They were a line, a stand. The fight pressed close. Thorne himself burst through the door, driven by more than orders, something personal, something vengeful. He was bigger, but Silas carried the rage of a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The rifles were useless now. It was fists, elbows, boots. 2 men crashing through the cabin and out into the blinding storm. They grappled in the white fury, breath pluming, boots slipping. Thorne's knife found Silas's arm, a hot slash in the cold. But pain only sharpened him. He slammed Thorne against a pine, the man's head striking bark with a dull crack. The blizzard began its slow work. Snow clung to Thorne's face, filled his mouth. His eyes. "God will judge you now," Silas rasped, pressing him into the drift. Then he left him there, a sacrifice to the storm's judgment. When Silas staggered back inside, blood darkening his sleeve, the cabin was quiet save for the girl's breathing. Nami rose from the cellar, her fear aimed not at the storm, not at the fight, just past, but at the wound in his arm. She tore a strip from her tunic, pressed it hard against the gash. Her touch was steady, sure, and for the first time in 5 years, Silas let someone else bear his weight. Part 5. The storm didn't break all at once. It lingered, stretching into 2 long days. The world beyond the cabin, sealed in white and silence. Inside, the bite of powder smoke had faded, replaced by the low rustle of blankets, the soft scrape of a kettle on the hearth, and the clean, sharp scent of pine resin poultice. Silas lay propped in the bed he had kept empty for years, the one he hadn't touched since Sarah went to Earth. Now, Nami moved quietly through the room, bringing fresh water, steeping herbs, binding his arm in strips torn from her own clothing. She worked without hesitation, without the wary guard she had carried when they first came. Her touch was sure, her eyes were steady. One by one, the girls began drifting up from the cellar in the daylight. The smallest would curl against Silas's good side, tracing the scars on his hand with tiny fingers. He didn't pull away, not anymore. Days slipped into weeks. The snow softened under a gentler sun, trickling into bright little streams that sang through the hollows. Birdsong returned. The scent of thawed earth seeped through the cabin walls. Silas found himself outside, his arms still stiff, but strong enough to work. He turned over a patch of ground beside the cabin, breaking frost-hard soil. The girls followed, curious. He showed them how to press kernels of corn into the dirt, to cover them gently with soil. Then beans, then squash. The three sisters of the plains. Their small hands worked beside his, their laughter rising like the first wildflowers of spring. One evening, he found Nami by the fire with a half-finished blanket in her lap. The pattern was simple, but in its center, she was weaving a hawk-wing spread, head turned as if watching over something unseen. He asked nothing, and she gave no words, but her eyes lifted to his in the firelight, and he knew the hawk was him. That night, after the others slept, Silas went to the mantel. The photograph of Sarah and Daniel waited there, worn soft at the edges from years of being held, stared at, grieved over. He stood with it a long time in his hands. Then he placed it in a small wooden box he had carved himself, closed the lid, and set it away, not forgotten, but no longer the thing that chained him. A week later, he carved again. Not a deer, not a hawk, a woman, straight-backed and proud, her hand extended to a small child. He left it on the table. In the morning, Nami found it. Her fingers moved over the wood slowly, her lips pressed tight. When she looked at him, her gaze held more than gratitude. It held something deeper, softer, and far more dangerous. Love, born from battle and winter's long watch. Years later, the cabin had changed. An added room stretched along its north wall. A garden lay thick and green under summer sun. Goats grazed on the hillside, their bells chiming faintly in the warm wind. On an evening painted in gold and purple, Silas and Nami stood on the porch, watching 10 young women, no longer girls, chase fireflies through the tall grass. The horizon burned with the kind of light that makes a man stop and breathe deep. Silas reached for her hand, his scarred fingers lacing with hers. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Some bonds don't need words. The world had once tried to leave them as ghosts, each alone in their own wilderness. Instead, they had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something unshakable, a family, rooted deep in the quiet heart of the frontier. The wind was softer now. It carried the smell of cut hay and warm earth, not snow and blood. The cabin that had once been a tomb now stood open to the summer light, its walls carrying the voices of 10 young women, voices that had once been locked in silence. Silas Blackwood, the man who had buried his heart 5 years before, now stood on the porch beside the woman who had walked barefoot through the storm to his door. They didn't speak much. They never had to. The language they'd built was quieter than words. A shared glance over the heads of children, the press of a calloused hand into another, the sound of footsteps side by side. If you were to pass their homestead in those years, you'd see the garden thick with beans and corn, the laundry line snapping in the wind, the small herd on the hillside. You might see a hawk wheel high overhead, as if keeping its own watch. You might not guess that the man and woman there had both been to the farthest edge of grief, that they had stood where life felt finished and had somehow found the courage to step back. Tell us, what did this story stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride. Some stories end with a bullet or a grave. This one ends with something rarer, the choice to stay, to build, to keep watch over what you've been given. If you've ever chosen silence over revenge, comment, "I understand, Silas," because family is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it's the one you fight for. Sometimes it's the one that walks to your door in the middle of a storm. And sometimes it's the one that teaches you how to live again.